We think we know the story of our planet, a neat progression from chipped stone tools to rockets leaving Earth's atmosphere, from firelight and dark caves to cities that never sleep. The textbooks tell us it all happened in the blink of an eye, just a few thousand years of recorded history. But what if that story is incomplete? What if, long before the pyramids, long before the first farmer planted grain, long before we even thought civilization was possible, Earth had already been home to another society, one that rose, thrived, and then vanished so completely that only whispers remain, not in monuments or machines, but in silence? The question sounds radical. It sounds like myth, like the stories of Atlantis or golden ages lost to flood and fire. And yet, beneath the surface of our assumptions lies a troubling thought. History is not the same as the past. History is only the part of the past we've managed to recover. The rest, far more vast, far more mysterious, is missing. Imagine for a moment that we are not the beginning of the human story, but the middle, that the timeline we celebrate is only one layer, built on the ruins of others erased by time itself. If such a society existed, how would we even know? What would survive 100,000 years? And what would be gone without a trace? To explore that possibility, we have to set aside certainty. We have to let go of the comforting straight line that runs from primitive ancestors to modern progress. We have to step back, widen the frame, and look at humanity and the Earth, not in centuries or millennia, but in geological time. And in that vast expanse, the truth is sobering. Almost nothing survives. Think of our own world today. The skyscrapers, the highways, the phones in our hands. Steel, concrete, glass. We believe these things to be permanent, but they are not. Stop maintaining them, and within decades the decay begins. Within centuries, forests and oceans reclaim them. Within a few thousand years, they crumble into dust. Now stretch that to 100,000 years. In that time, whole continents change shape. Ice sheets grind the land. Rivers carve new valleys. Mountains rise and fall. Even the ground beneath our feet can be recycled, pulled back into Earth's mantle by the slow drift of tectonic plates. What would be left of us? Perhaps a few traces in deep geological layers. A thin chemical fingerprint of our industry. But the cities, the machines, the monuments, gone. Even our proudest achievements would dissolve into the earth. So when archaeologists tell us there is no evidence of a civilization before Sumer or Egypt, that does not necessarily mean none existed. It may only mean the evidence is gone, or buried in places we have never thought to look. The timeline we rely on feels solid, but it is fragile. We say agriculture began about 12,000 years ago in scattered places around the globe. We point to Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the early Chinese dynasties, and call them the first civilizations. And compared to the hundreds of thousands of years our species has existed, these cultures are recent, just a flicker at the end of a long night. Homo sapiens has walked the earth for at least 300,000 years. That means 95% of our story, maybe more, lies in the dark before what we call history. We assume those ages were empty of civilization because we have not yet found clear evidence. But is that assumption safe? Consider Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Carved stone pillars arranged in circles decorated with animal reliefs, aligned with surprising precision. It is more than 11,000 years old, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids. For decades, the idea of such monumental architecture before farming and cities was unthinkable. Yet, there it is, a site so ancient, it rewrote our understanding of what early humans could achieve. Now imagine what else lies undiscovered, what lies destroyed, what lies under the sea, where coastlines once stretched during the last ice age. Entire landscapes that were prime real estate for ancient people are now drowned beneath hundreds of feet of water. If they built anything there, it is hidden, waiting. When you start to think in this way, the question is no longer, is there evidence of a lost civilization? The question becomes, how much evidence would we even expect to survive? And the answer is very little. Time is relentless. Rain, wind, frost, erosion, the slow but unstoppable drift of tectonic plates, the crushing weight of glaciers that grind mountains into dust. Even the tallest skyscraper today, left untended, would not last. 100,000 years is not enough to preserve it. It is enough to erase it. And so, if another society once walked this earth, its ruins would be hidden, scattered, unrecognizable. Perhaps only faint anomalies in the soil, strange isotopes in the rock, myths carried across generations, traces we overlook because we are not expecting to see them. Because in science, what we find is shaped by what we look for. Archaeologists search where they believe evidence will exist. They dig at known sites, follow the trail of records, explore caves where artifacts survive. Few look for cities beneath the sea. Few dig down to layers 100,000 years old. Why? Because our narrative tells us nothing advanced should be there. And so the story becomes circular. We find what we expect, and we expect what we find. The neat line of history remains neat, but perhaps only because we have not asked the dangerous question, what if it is incomplete? Pause for a moment and consider the possibility. That Earth has already seen more than one civilization, that we are not the first to dream, to build, to imagine the stars. If true, the implications are staggering. It would mean progress is not a straight climb, but a cycle of rise, collapse, and rebirth. It would mean we are not unique, not inevitable, not permanent. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it would force us to ask, where did they go? Did they vanish in fire, in flood and famine? Did they destroy themselves with tools they could not control? Or did they fade quietly, leaving nothing behind but silence, until time closed over their story? If it happened once, it could happen again. And suddenly, the question of a lost civilization is not just about the past. It is about the future, about us. In geology, there is a phrase, deep time. It refers to the incomprehensible scale on which Earth moves, not in years, not even in millennia, but in epochs. Mountains are born and die, oceans open and close, ice swallows continents, then retreats. In the span of deep time, even the grandest achievements can vanish without a trace. To understand what could be lost, we must understand how Earth forgets. Start with erosion. Water is the great leveler. Rivers carve through stone like scalpels. Rain turns walls to rubble. Floods bury cities in layers of silt. Wind scours the land, slowly shaving it down. Ice, slow, relentless, grinds everything beneath it into a fine, uniform powder. These are not catastrophic forces. They are patient, indifferent, and over tens of thousands of years, they are unstoppable. Then there is plate tectonics. The Earth's crust is not static. It floats atop molten rock, shifting constantly. Mountains rise and fall, continents drift. Sometimes entire sections of the Earth's surface are pulled downward, subducted into the mantle, where they melt and are recycled. In this way, even the bedrock can vanish. Over a few million years, a city built on the wrong fault line might not just be buried. It might be unmade, atom by atom. And finally, there is the sea. At the height of the last ice age, some 20,000 years ago, sea levels were over 400 feet lower than today. Vast stretches of what is now seabed were dry land, rich temperate plains along the edges of continents. These would have been ideal places to settle, abundant in resources, sheltered from the interior's extremes. If early civilizations existed, the coastlines would have been their cradle, but today those cradles are drowned. And we do not excavate the ocean floor, not in any systematic way. It is costly, difficult, and dangerous. Our underwater exploration is in its infancy. A few percent of the seabed has been mapped in detail. What lies beneath those waves is largely unknown. If a lost civilization had built along those ancient shores, its remains may now lie beneath hundreds of feet of water and sediment, fragmented and unrecognizable. Their architecture, if it was organic, would have dissolved. Their metals corroded. Their records, if they had any, would be pulp, dust, or silt. And here is the uncomfortable truth. In 100,000 years, even our own world might suffer the same fate. We like to believe our era is permanent, that satellites in orbit, nuclear reactors, plastic in the oceans, these things will mark us forever. But even these signs have limits. Satellites fall. The radiation of space degrades them. Nuclear facilities, if left to decay, become indistinct. Plastic may persist longer than many materials, but even it degrades under pressure and sunlight. It becomes microplastic, then chemical traces, and buried deep enough, even those might vanish into the churn of geology. What about our bones? Human remains are fragile. Most never fossilize. Most decay in the soil, washed away by rain, consumed by microbes, broken down over time. Fossils are rare not because life is rare, but because the conditions for preservation are. Now consider that we have only discovered a fraction of Earth's fossils, mostly from specific environments that favor preservation: deserts, caves, dry valleys. The rest, whatever it once was, is gone. In light of this, we should ask not why we haven't found evidence of a prior civilization, but how astonishing it is that we have found anything at all. And yet, sometimes we do find things that don't fit, that resist easy explanation. Strange anomalies, outliers, sites and objects that raise more questions than they answer. Göbekli Tepe is one. So is the city of Jericho, whose earliest walls date back nearly 10,000 years, predating metal tools and agriculture as we know it. So too are underwater ruins like those off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan. Their status as natural or artificial still hotly debated. There are others, pieces that seem out of place, artifacts whose age, composition, or sophistication doesn't match the standard timeline. Often dismissed, sometimes ignored, and yet they persist. In India, there are ancient texts that describe flying machines, vimanas, with mechanical detail. In Egypt, myths of ages before the pharaohs, when gods walked among men. In Mesoamerica, legends of sunken cities, of ages lost to water. These stories are not proof, but they are not random either. Myth, after all, is not always fiction. Sometimes it is memory, warped, mythologized, distorted through time, but still memory. Consider the global flood stories. Nearly every ancient culture has one, a great deluge that swept the world, a civilization destroyed by rising waters, survivors who floated or climbed or rebuilt from nothing. These tales echo from Mesopotamia to Polynesia, from the Andes to the Arctic. Why? Coincidence or a shared trauma encoded in story? During the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose rapidly, sometimes catastrophically. Glacial melt flooded vast areas, swallowed coastal settlements, and reshaped the face of continents. If humans lived near those ancient shores, they would have witnessed the waters rising day by day, year by year. And when their cities were lost, when their people scattered, what else could they do but remember it in stories? Over millennia, those stories became myth, and we, modern and confident, call them fiction. But what if they aren't? What if, buried within the flood myths, the golden ages, the fallen towers and sunken lands, there are echoes of something real, not gods, not magic, but people like us, dreaming, building, falling. If so, then the past is not just deeper than we imagined. It is stranger, fuller, more fragile. And if we hope to find it, we must change how we look. Because archaeology is not just about digging. It is about expectation. We find what we are prepared to recognize. And so far, we've been prepared to find simple tools, early huts, bone fragments, not cities, not knowledge. But what if the knowledge once existed and left only the faintest scars? In 2018, two scientists posed a strange and provocative question in a formal academic paper. Would it be possible to detect an advanced civilization that lived on Earth millions of years ago and has since vanished without a trace? This thought experiment became known as the Silurian hypothesis, named, half-jokingly, after a race of intelligent reptiles in a British science fiction series. But the idea itself was not satire. It was a sober scientific question. If industrial societies had existed in Earth's distant past, could we even know? The authors, Gavin Schmidt, a climatologist with NASA, and Adam Frank, an astrophysicist, weren't arguing that such a civilization had existed. Rather, they were asking whether Earth's geological record would even preserve such a thing, and if so, what kinds of evidence would survive. Their conclusion was unsettling. Not much would remain. Civilization, they argued, leaves a geological fingerprint, but it's subtle, not concrete and glass, but chemistry, a spike in carbon dioxide, a sudden layer of synthetic compounds, heavy metals, or isotopes not naturally produced, a brief disruption in the planet's carbon cycle, a warming event that departs from known natural patterns. Sound familiar? The scientists noted that the industrial age, our own, has already altered the Earth, sea sediments, and atmosphere. We are laying down a layer that could, in theory, be detectable millions of years in the future, but only just. Even now, the signals are faint, and we are the ones creating them. In 10 million years, the traces may still be there. In 100 million, maybe not. It would depend on luck, on whether the strata that preserve our era are ever uplifted and exposed, on whether the right samples are collected, interpreted, believed, and even then, would future scientists recognize those signals as evidence of a lost civilization, or just another natural anomaly? The Silurian hypothesis was not embraced universally. It raised discomfort, even ridicule, but it served its purpose, forcing a shift in perspective. Because if we are barely detectable, even in our technological prime, then what about anyone before us? What if an earlier civilization, whether human or not, had reached a technological plateau, used fossil fuels, altered their atmosphere, and then vanished? What if the only trace they left was a brief geochemical spike? Would we recognize it? And more importantly, would we accept it? This is where science meets its own blind spots. Because in a discipline built on observation and pattern, the outlier is often discarded. The unexpected is filtered out, not from conspiracy, but from the need to draw firm conclusions. But when your frame of reference is incomplete, when you're staring at a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, even the right answer can look like noise. So what would we need to find to prove a lost civilization existed in the deep past? Concrete evidence, artificial materials embedded in old rock layers, signs of mining or metallurgy where none should be, patterns of settlement, long-term land modification, fossils of tools, or even engineered artifacts. But here's the problem. The deeper in time you go, the more nature strips away those signs. Our planet is an active one. It reshapes itself constantly. Rock is folded, seafloors vanish, erosion cleanses the surface, organics decompose. Even the hardest materials are no match for time measured in millions of years. If another industrial society lived 300,000 years ago, or even 3 million, we might never know, unless we learn to look differently. In archaeology, context is everything. A flint tool found in the wrong layer might be dismissed as a modern intrusion. A piece of metal corroded and fragmented might be overlooked if its presence doesn't fit the narrative. But what if the narrative itself is flawed? What if our baseline, our assumption that we are the first, is wrong? That's not a call for wild speculation. It's a call for humility, for the understanding that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when nature is designed to erase. And there's another problem. Much of the Earth's surface is simply inaccessible. Dense jungle hides ruins for millennia. Deserts bury them in sand. Polar regions entomb them in ice. Oceans swallow them whole. How much of the Earth has been thoroughly explored, truly examined, layer by layer, for traces of lost culture? The truth is, almost none of it. We've excavated a fraction of the surface. We focus where we expect finds and ignore where we do not. Even where we do dig, the deepest layers are often passed over. Why? Because they're assumed to be too old, too primitive, irrelevant. And so, the past remains hidden, not because it isn't there, but because we have not yet imagined it could be. For centuries, myths have been dismissed as fantasy. Stories of gods, of giants, of great floods and forgotten ages viewed as symbolic, poetic, or purely fictional. But in recent decades, a new approach has emerged, one that treats myth not as superstition, but as cultural memory. Passed down orally for generations, these stories may encode real events, refracted through the lens of metaphor, belief, and time. And when examined closely, patterns emerge. Take the flood myth. It appears almost everywhere. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Sumerian god warns Utnapishtim of a coming deluge. He builds a boat, saves animals, and survives the flood. In the book of Genesis, Noah does the same. In India's Satapatha Brahmana, the god Vishnu takes the form of a fish to warn Manu of rising waters. In the Maya Popol Vuh, previous worlds end in floods. In Aboriginal Australian stories, rising seas swallow coastlines. In Norse myth, the world is drowned before rebirth. These stories span continents and languages. They were written, or spoken, thousands of years apart. And yet, the themes are strikingly consistent. A great civilization, a warning ignored, a flood, and a world lost. Coincidence, or something else? During the end of the last ice age, global temperatures rose sharply. Glaciers melted. Sea levels rose by more than 400 feet, not all at once, but in surges. Sometimes these events were sudden. The Meltwater Pulse 1A event, for example, raised sea levels by over 20 feet in less than 500 years. Fast enough to drown coastlines and displace entire populations. Imagine living on those coasts, watching the water inch higher, season after season, watching rivers swell, forests disappear, and finally, as the seas rushed in, everything gone. No writing, no satellite data, just memory and story, passed down by survivors, generation after generation, until it became myth, and myth became legend. Plato's story of Atlantis, for instance, is often cited, and just as often dismissed. Written in the Timaeus and Critias dialogues, Plato describes a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time. A naval power technologically advanced but morally corrupt. In a single day and night, it is swallowed by the sea. Most scholars see this as allegory, a philosophical metaphor for hubris and decline. But what if Plato was preserving an older story, one he heard from Egyptian priests, who claimed it came from their own ancient records? If Atlantis was real, it may not have been a single city, but a stand-in for multiple coastal cultures lost during post-glacial sea level rise. Plato's dates might be symbolic, his geography speculative, but the core idea of a world-ending flood and a forgotten people matches stories found across the globe. Even in the Americas, flood stories abound. The Hopi tell of previous worlds destroyed by water. The Inca speak of a time when the sun vanished and the earth was flooded. The Ojibwa describe water covering the land, with a few survivors floating on the back of a giant turtle. What are these, if not fragments of memory, woven into culture, distorted, yes, but not meaningless? Then there are the stories of the first times, golden ages, when people lived in peace, in harmony with knowledge lost in later eras. In West African oral tradition, there are tales of ancient empires, long gone, that built with metals unknown today. In Indian texts, like the Mahabharata, wars are described with terrifying weapons. Flying machines fire from the sky, cities turn to ash. To the modern reader, these stories sound fantastical. But remember, myth is often metaphor. Fire from the sky might not be a god's wrath, but a memory of catastrophe. War in the heavens may be a poetic way of describing a very real destruction. So the question becomes, can myth carry truth, even if it's not literal? More and more, scholars are beginning to say yes. In Australia, Aboriginal Dreamtime stories tell of landscapes that match prehistoric geography, now submerged. In Siberia, legends of exploding mountains correspond with known volcanic eruptions. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous stories of great waves and ground-shaking beasts are now understood as oral accounts of ancient tsunamis and earthquakes. These are not coincidences. They are proof that oral tradition can preserve real events, even tens of thousands of years old. So when we hear tales of lost cities, sunken lands, or ancient peoples who reached for the stars, we must ask, what are they trying to tell us? Maybe they're echoes, garbled, fragmented, distorted by time, but echoes nonetheless of a deeper truth, not that gods built machines, but that people once did. Not that towers touch the sky, but that once long ago someone built higher than we imagined possible for their time. And when it all fell, the memory didn't disappear. It transformed into myth, into legend, into the stories that carried fragments of their world into ours. If a civilization had existed before history began, its traces would be subtle, fragmented, misunderstood. We wouldn't expect to find shining cities beneath the sands or blueprints etched in stone. We would find outliers, inconvenient objects, things that don't quite fit, that are either dismissed, debated, or quietly forgotten. They are known, often pejoratively, as out-of-place artifacts, OOP parts. To mainstream science, most of these artifacts are misinterpretations, hoaxes, or honest mistakes. And often that's true, but a few remain stubbornly unresolved, objects that don't belong in the strata or context in which they're found. Tools or patterns too advanced for the supposed timeline. Items that raise questions the historical framework is not ready to answer. Take the Antikythera mechanism. Recovered from a shipwreck off the coast of Greece in 1901, it appeared at first to be little more than a lump of corroded bronze. But over decades of study, X-ray imaging revealed its astonishing complexity. Over 30 interlocking gears in a compact housing designed to model astronomical positions, predict eclipses, and track planetary motions with extraordinary precision. It dates to the 2nd century BCE, and nothing else like it would appear in the historical record for over 1,000 years. We know where it came from. We can place it in a cultural context, and yet it still challenges our assumptions about ancient technological sophistication. Now, imagine discovering such a device, but with no context, no shipwreck, no inscriptions, no clear provenance, just a gear or a shard of engineered material in a layer of earth dated far earlier than expected. Would it even be recognized for what it was? There are other anomalies. In the 1960s, stone tools were found in Mexico's Valsequillo Basin. The site, known as Hueyatlaco, was excavated under careful supervision. The tools were crude, but the stratigraphy was clear. The layers in which they were found dated, through multiple lines of evidence, to over 200,000 years ago. That date was so far outside the accepted timeline for human presence in the Americas that the findings were met not with excitement, but with controversy and professional risk. The lead archaeologist, Cynthia Irwin-Williams, distanced herself from the conclusions. Later researchers who tried to revisit the data faced funding problems and skepticism, yet the evidence remains. In Africa, footprints preserved in volcanic ash date back nearly 4 million years. They show clear signs of bipedal walking, of hominins moving in pairs, possibly families, not civilization, but intention, social behavior, a shadow of the self-awareness that would later build cities. In South America, stone spheres, massive and perfectly shaped, lie scattered across the jungles of Costa Rica. Their purpose is unknown, their makers unnamed. They serve no clear function, no inscriptions, no explanation. Are they ceremonial? Are they natural? Are they remnants of a culture whose records have not survived? Even in our own time, the Sahara reveals hints of something more. Beneath its sands lie structures and ruins not yet fully explored. Satellite imagery shows patterns, straight lines, regular shapes, buried under dunes. Are these simple geological forms or the buried bones of an older world? And underwater, the puzzles deepen. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka, divers have found submerged structures, stone blocks, and walls in geometric patterns, at depths suggesting they were last above water over 9,000 years ago. Further south, in the Gulf of Cambay, sonar has revealed what some claim to be city-like grids beneath 120 feet of water. These findings remain contested. Some say they are natural formations. Others believe they are proof of human habitation long before the conventional rise of civilization. We cannot yet say which is true. But again, the pattern emerges. The anomalies do not form a clear picture. They do not scream their meaning. They whisper. And often we are too loud with our assumptions to hear them. If we expect simplicity, we will not recognize sophistication. If we assume a timeline, we will not question an outlier. And so, these artifacts, the spheres, the mechanisms, the stone tools in impossible strata, remain on the fringes, collected, documented, then shelved. But what if we paused, set aside the expectation, and asked, not what should be here, but what is? In doing so, we might begin to see a different picture, not proof, but possibility. Not a lost civilization shining brightly across time, but one glimpsed only in fragments. A presence obscured not by secrecy, but by time. Not by conspiracy, but by the quiet, persistent forgetting of the earth itself. And in this shadowed space, we can begin to ask a deeper question. What might such a civilization have looked like? Not just in terms of buildings or tools, but in values, in systems, in choices. Would it resemble us or be something wholly other? If a civilization had existed before history began, its traces would be subtle, fragmented, misunderstood. We wouldn't expect to find shining cities beneath the sands or blueprints etched in stone. We would find outliers, inconvenient objects, things that don't quite fit, that are either dismissed, debated, or quietly forgotten. They are known, often pejoratively, as out-of-place artifacts, OOP parts. To mainstream science, most of these artifacts are misinterpretations, hoaxes, or honest mistakes. And often that's true, but a few remain stubbornly unresolved, objects that don't belong in the strata or context in which they're found. Tools or patterns too advanced for the supposed timeline. Items that raise questions the historical framework is not ready to answer. Take the Antikythera mechanism. Recovered from a shipwreck off the coast of Greece in 1901, it appeared at first to be little more than a lump of corroded bronze. But over decades of study, X-ray imaging revealed its astonishing complexity. Over 30 interlocking gears in a compact housing designed to model astronomical positions, predict eclipses, and track planetary motions with extraordinary precision. It dates to the 2nd century BCE, and nothing else like it would appear in the historical record for over 1,000 years. We know where it came from. We can place it in a cultural context. And yet it still challenges our assumptions about ancient technological sophistication. Now imagine discovering such a device, but with no context, no shipwreck, no inscriptions, no clear provenance. Just a gear or a shard of engineered material in a layer of earth dated far earlier than expected. Would it even be recognized for what it was? There are other anomalies. In the 1960s, stone tools were found in Mexico's Valsequillo Basin. The site, known as Hueyatlaco, was excavated under careful supervision. The tools were crude, but the stratigraphy was clear. The layers in which they were found dated, through multiple lines of evidence, to over 200,000 years ago. That date was so far outside the accepted timeline for human presence in the Americas that the findings were met not with excitement, but with controversy and professional risk. The lead archaeologist, Cynthia Irwin Williams, distanced herself from the conclusions. Later researchers who tried to revisit the data faced funding problems and skepticism, yet the evidence remains. In Africa, footprints preserved in volcanic ash date back nearly 4 million years. They show clear signs of bipedal walking, of hominins moving in pairs, possibly families, not civilization, but intention, social behavior, a shadow of the self-awareness that would later build cities. In South America, stone spheres, massive and perfectly shaped, lie scattered across the jungles of Costa Rica. Their purpose is unknown, their makers unnamed. They serve no clear function, no inscriptions, no explanation. Are they ceremonial? Are they natural? Are they remnants of a culture whose records have not survived? Even in our own time, the Sahara reveals hints of something more. Beneath its sands lie structures and ruins not yet fully explored. Satellite imagery shows patterns, straight lines, regular shapes, buried under dunes. Are these simple geological forms or the buried bones of an older world? And underwater, the puzzles deepen. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka, divers have found submerged structures, stone blocks, and walls in geometric patterns, at depths suggesting they were last above water over 9,000 years ago. Further south, in the Gulf of Cambay, sonar has revealed what some claim to be city-like grids beneath 120 feet of water. These findings remain contested. Some say they are natural formations. Others believe they are proof of human habitation long before the conventional rise of civilization. We cannot yet say which is true. But again, the pattern emerges. The anomalies do not form a clear picture. They do not scream their meaning. They whisper. And often we are too loud with our assumptions to hear them. If we expect simplicity, we will not recognize sophistication. If we assume a timeline, we will not question an outlier. And so, these artifacts, the spheres, the mechanisms, the stone tools in impossible strata, remain on the fringes, collected, documented, then shelved. But what if we paused, set aside the expectation, and asked, not what should be here, but what is? In doing so, we might begin to see a different picture, not proof, but possibility. Not a lost civilization shining brightly across time, but one glimpsed only in fragments. A presence obscured not by secrecy, but by time. Not by conspiracy, but by the quiet, persistent forgetting of the earth itself. And in this shadowed space, we can begin to ask a deeper question. What might such a civilization have looked like? Not just in terms of buildings or tools, but in values, in systems, in choices. Would it resemble us or be something wholly other? When we imagine an advanced civilization, our minds go immediately to our own reflection. Skyscrapers, satellites, highways, plastics, energy grids, a world mapped, electrified, connected, a world made of noise and light. But must civilization look like ours to be advanced? If another society existed in Earth's deep past, there's no reason to assume it followed our path. No reason to assume it discovered the same things, in the same order, in the same way. Intelligence does not guarantee industrialization. Sophistication does not demand smoke and steel. It's possible, even likely, that an ancient civilization shaped by a different climate, different challenges, and a different worldview might have chosen a path we would not recognize as modern at all. Consider a civilization rooted in ecological harmony rather than domination, one that developed technology not to remake nature, but to move within it. Seamlessly, quietly, biodegradable materials, organic structures, energy harnessed from wind, water, sunlight, not to power machines of industry, but to enhance quality of life in subtler, more sustainable ways. Such a society might not leave ruins of stone. It might leave gardens, patterns, soil enriched in strange ways, genetic traces in crops or animals long since naturalized. It might not build towers, but networks, cooperative systems that spread quietly across regions, integrated with the land, rather than imposed on it. How would we detect that? Would we even think to look? We tend to equate complexity with metal, progress with scale. But in doing so, we blind ourselves to other forms of advancement, the kinds that do not leave scars. What if the apex of their achievement wasn't a machine, but an idea, a governance system so stable it lasted millennia, a medical philosophy that prevented disease without surgery or drugs, a cultural model that avoided war for generations? These things leave little in the archaeological record. No tools, no bones, no smoke. And yet they may mark a society more advanced, in some ways, than ours. It's also possible that such a civilization did develop technology recognizable to us, that it knew metallurgy, astronomy, engineering, that it built cities and roads, that it rose, like we have, and then fell, leaving behind only the barest chemical ghosts. Or perhaps their advancement was different in kind. Perhaps they understood the genome, not as we do, through brute force sequencing, but through direct intuitive engagement. Perhaps their medicine was encoded in ritual, their history preserved not in books, but in songs, calibrated to memory and time. Perhaps they lived long lives, not through drugs, but through control of stress, diet, rhythm, things science is only now beginning to rediscover. All of this, we must acknowledge, is speculative. But speculation, grounded in science and constrained by plausibility, is not the same as fantasy. It is a tool, a way to model what might be possible, given what we know, and more importantly, what we don't. We know that Homo sapiens has been anatomically modern for over 300,000 years. We know that behavioral modernity, the use of symbols, tools, abstract thought, stretches back at least 70,000 years, likely more. That's a vast window of time, long enough not just for a civilization to rise, but for several to do so, one after another, each perhaps with its own character, its own triumphs, its own tragedy. And yet, nearly all of that window lies in darkness. If a people once mastered their environment, lived in complex societies, recorded their knowledge in perishable form, bamboo, bark, cloth, memory, then their legacy might be lost entirely, even their bones scattered, eroded, unrecognized, even their tools mistaken for natural shapes or misplaced by time, even their stories reduced to myth. And so we return to a haunting possibility that we might be walking over the graves of forgotten worlds and not know it, that what we call the Chichimorpha dawn of civilization may only be the latest flicker of a long and broken flame. It humbles the narrative we tell about ourselves, and it challenges a core belief that progress is linear, that we have come from darkness into light, from simplicity into complexity, from ignorance into knowledge. But what if the cycle is older? What if the arc has bent before? If such a civilization did once exist, sophisticated, complex, and long forgotten, then one question echoes above all others. What happened to it? The popular imagination leans toward catastrophe, great floods, cosmic impacts, sudden destruction. But in truth, the end of a civilization rarely comes in a single day or night. More often, it unravels slowly. Systems stretch, fray, collapse under weight. They were never built to bear. We see it in the record we do have, the history we know. The Maya civilization in Mesoamerica, with its towering temples and refined astronomical knowledge, declined over centuries, not from a single cause but many: prolonged drought, deforestation, soil exhaustion, internal strife. Cities emptied, trade routes withered, a proud and brilliant culture dimmed to silence. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire collapsed after a period of intense drought. A once thriving urban network brought down by the slow failure of the rains. In the Indus Valley, signs of climate change coincide with urban abandonment. Once regular rivers shifted course, agricultural systems failed, and at each of these inflection points, people adapted. They moved, they survived, they changed. But the complexity that had sustained their golden ages was lost. So what if the same has happened before, only earlier? Deeper in time, where records cannot reach? A society might rise, master its environment, even achieve great things. But the very complexity that makes civilization possible is also what makes it fragile. Networks are delicate. Infrastructure depends on balance. Technology, however advanced, cannot control the Earth itself, especially if that Earth begins to change. Consider the end of the last ice age. As glaciers retreated and sea levels rose, coastlines transformed. Fertile plains disappeared beneath water. Climatic zones shifted. What had once been habitable, even ideal, became unstable. If an advanced society had developed during the glacial period, perhaps along the vast coastal plains now buried by oceans, then sea level rise alone could have destroyed its heartlands. Cities, ports, farms, all drowned. The survivors, scattered inland, might have been unable to preserve what their ancestors had built. Add to this the threat of natural catastrophe. The Earth is not a gentle host. It has known extinction events, magnetic reversals, supervolcanoes, solar flares. Even a moderate volcanic eruption can trigger a global temperature drop. A large asteroid, like the one that ended the age of the dinosaurs, would leave almost no survivors. If such an event struck at the height of a civilization's power, it could erase it, not just physically but culturally. Survivors would revert to simpler forms of living. Knowledge would degrade within generations. Complex writing systems, mathematical concepts, scientific principles, all vulnerable to loss if they are not actively preserved. And perhaps the most haunting possibility of all, collapse from within, not by flood, not by fire, but by misjudgment, overreach, pollution, exhaustion of resources, inequality, war. We like to think of civilization as self-correcting, that wisdom accumulates, that progress is permanent. But history shows otherwise. Societies make mistakes. They overexploit. They divide. They ignore warning signs until it is too late. And if a society had done so long before our own, who would remain to tell their story? No one. Only soil and silence. Only the myths. The possibility of collapse is not a morbid curiosity. It is a mirror, one we must have the courage to look into. Because we too are complex. We too depend on fragile systems. We live in an age of extraordinary technological power and equally extraordinary vulnerability. Climate change, ecological loss, energy instability, artificial intelligence, even the quiet erosion of trust and truth. We do not yet know how our story ends. But if Earth has seen civilization rise before and fall, then we are not the first to face this question. We are simply the first to ask it from orbit. So perhaps the most urgent lesson of a lost civilization is not about their greatness, but their disappearance. The warning is not in what they built, it's in what they left behind. Nothing. When we look at the history of our species, the pattern is strange and sobering. Homo sapiens has existed for at least 300,000 years, and yet civilization, as we define it, only appears in the last 6,000. That's less than 2% of our total existence. A blink. What happened in the other 98%? The common assumption is not much. That early humans lived as nomadic bands, hunting and gathering, repeating the same simple lives for hundreds of millennia, that nothing really changed, and certainly nothing that could be called civilization ever emerged. But is that assumption justified, or is it based on the absence of evidence, not evidence of absence? This is the time gap problem, a simple but uncomfortable truth. Most of human prehistory is missing, not because it didn't happen, but because the physical record is gone, erased by time, by erosion, by ocean rise, by tectonics, by the fact that our earliest ancestors lived lightly on the earth, in ways that Donati preserve well in stone, metal, or fossil. Imagine trying to reconstruct a city from 100,000 years ago. If it were made of wood, of clay, of organic materials, it would rot. If it were buried, it might compact into undistinguished sediment. If it stood on a coastline, now lost to rising seas, it would lie beneath hundreds of feet of water, unreachable without deep-sea excavation. Even today, entire modern towns disappear under forest in a generation. Within 300 years, steel collapses, concrete crumbles, plastics degrade, and if buried under sediment, most of what we consider modern vanishes completely within a few thousand years. So what of 10,000 years? 50,000? 100,000? The problem is scale. In deep time, everything vanishes. The Ice Age ended just 12,000 years ago. At that time, vast ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were 400 feet lower. Coastlines extended miles beyond their current borders. Entire continents looked different. And yet, we have only a sliver of archaeological material from that period. Not because humans weren't alive, but because so much has simply been lost. Now extend that back to 50,000 years ago. We know humans had language, art, symbolism, burial customs, music, navigation. They crossed oceans, colonized Australia. They painted on cave walls in forms as sophisticated and moving as anything produced in modern times. And then, silence. For tens of thousands of years, the archaeological record gives us little more than fragments, tools, bones, fire pits, hints, whispers. Where did they go? What were they doing? What stories, what memories, what discoveries have we lost? Not because they were never made, but because time has buried them? This silence is not a flat void. It is a shrouded expanse, an unexplored frontier of the human story. We tend to see time as linear, but history, especially deep history, is full of gaps, places where nothing is known and where almost anything could have happened, and this raises a profound possibility. That civilization, as we know it, is not the inevitable result of human evolution. It is not the only time we've organized, built, imagined, and perhaps even reached heights we cannot now recognize. It may have happened before, and left almost nothing behind. This idea is not about believing in lost empires or hidden technology. It's about understanding how deeply selective the historical record really is. What we find depends on where we look, and where we look depends on what we believe is possible. But if we widen that belief even slightly, then the silence of those missing millennia becomes less of a void and more of a question. Not, did it happen? But why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't intelligent, symbolic, socially organized humans with language, memory, tools, and time eventually form complex societies? Not once, but many times. Not always with fire and wheel, but with other tools, other values, other visions of what it meant to live in the world. And if they did, how easily would we miss them? The answer, it turns out, is very easily. We already have. The earth forgets, stone wears away, metal corrodes, buildings fall, stories fade, but the body remembers. Inside every human being is a code, a history, written not in books or monuments, but in molecules. DNA, 4 letters, billions of characters, a record carried from generation to generation across thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. Our genes don't speak in names or dates, but they remember journeys, migrations, mergers, divides, bottlenecks, extinctions. They carry the traces of who we are and, perhaps, of who came before us. For most of the 20th century, archaeology told one story and genetics told another. But in the 21st, those two fields have begun to converge, and what they reveal is more complex and more mysterious than we once believed. Take the Denisovans, Until just a few decades ago, they were completely unknown, a vanished branch of the human family tree. No ruins, no tools, no cave art. Just a sliver of bone found in a cave in Siberia. And from that sliver, an entire population was discovered, one that lived alongside Homo sapiens for tens of thousands of years. We never found their cities, if they had any. We don't know their names or their stories, but we carry their DNA. Up to 5% of the genome of some modern human populations, particularly in Oceania and Southeast Asia, comes from them, a people lost to history, preserved only in the living, and they are not alone. Neanderthals, too, live within us. Once seen as brutish and inferior, they are now understood to have made art, tools, music. They buried their dead, they tended the sick, and they interbred with our ancestors. Today, nearly all non-African humans carry between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA. This raises a profound idea that entire populations, entire cultures, can vanish from the archaeological record, and yet still survive within us, not as memory, but as code, not as legend, but as sequence. So what else might be hidden there? If an ancient civilization rose and fell in the deep past, tens or even hundreds of thousands of years ago, it is possible that their genes still echo in ours, in subtle traits, in adaptive advantages, in patterns we have not yet learned to decode. After all, most of our genome is still a mystery. We understand the basics, the building blocks, the switches, but the vast intergenic regions, the so-called junk DNA, are poorly understood. Within them may lie evolutionary experiments, forgotten adaptations, legacies of peoples long vanished from the physical world, but still alive in the cellular one. Even cultural behaviors may have genetic components, tendencies toward cooperation, language use, environmental awareness. These are shaped by both nature and nurture. And if certain traits proved advantageous in past civilizations, they may have been passed down, selected for, preserved, even as the cultures themselves collapsed and were forgotten. This is not fantasy. It is the logic of evolution. Genes do not care whether a culture left monuments. They care only that it survived long enough to reproduce. So, the next time we marvel at the silence of the past, at how little remains from the deep stretches of human prehistory, we might also consider that part of that past still walks the earth. In us, the shape of a cheekbone, the color of an eye, a quirk of metabolism, a cognitive edge. Every human being is a mosaic of ancient stories, most of which we will never read in full. But some chapters, however faint, still echo. And if we learn to listen carefully enough, we may yet begin to understand not only where we came from, but who came before us. The earth remembers differently. The body remembers. But so does the earth, not in words, not in code, but in patterns, in anomalies, in scars. We often think of geology as indifferent, the slow churn of plates, the rhythm of erosion, the random violence of volcanoes and quakes. But sometimes, in the quiet corners of the world, there are things that don't fit, structures where none should be, patterns that resist explanation, a massive platform beneath the sea, megaliths that predate agriculture, a layer of glass beneath a desert, fused by heat no lightning strike could produce. We call them outliers. We call them curiosities. We file them away. But what if they are signals? Civilizations leave traces, but not always the kind we expect. Not every culture builds skyward. Not every innovation leaves tools. Some use materials that decay. Others pass knowledge without writing. And over tens of thousands of years, even mountains turn to dust. But not everything vanishes. A mine where there should be none. Metal alloys centuries ahead of their time. Global myths of fire from the sky, of floods, of resets, of first people who came before. In the 21st century, our instruments have grown sharper. We can scan entire continents from space. We can peer beneath jungles, sand, and ice. And what we're beginning to see is unsettling. Roadways hidden beneath Amazonian canopy, gridded city plans where none should exist, massive geometric shapes visible only from the air, as if meant to be seen by something flying. These aren't proof, not yet. But they are patterns, and in science, patterns are the beginning of every question. If even a handful of these anomalies point to something real, a culture erased not by time alone, but by catastrophe or design, then we must rethink everything we assume about prehistory. Because just as genes carry echoes of people long gone, so too might the Earth carry echoes of civilizations we've never known, not in textbooks, but in tectonic layers, in magnetic fields, in isotopes that don't belong. If a people rose before us and fell, the Earth would not forget entirely. It would mark the event subtly in the crust, in a thin line of strange material, in a spike of radiation, in an absence where there should be presence. We call this the Anthropocene, an age in which human activity leaves a measurable mark on the planet. But what if this isn't the first? What if the Earth has seen this before? What if the fossil record contains not just life, but legacy? And what if our greatest discoveries will not be dug from ancient tombs, but read from the layers beneath our feet and the sky above our heads? The silence may not be accidental. We assume that if something existed, we would have found it. That absence is proof of non-existence. But what if the silence is not just time and erosion? What if it was made? Erasure is not a new idea. We do it ourselves. We bury the past when it's inconvenient. We rewrite history. We burn libraries. We flood valleys. We pave over ruins, sometimes to control a narrative, sometimes out of fear, sometimes simply to forget. If we, a young species with short memory, are capable of such deliberate forgetting, then why not those who may have come before us? What if they too faced collapse, not just of cities, but of knowledge? What if they chose to vanish or had no choice? Imagine a civilization that reached too far, that unlocked forces it could not contain, that witnessed its own undoing, not over centuries, but in a single generation. Would they try to warn those who came after, or would they try to bury what they had done? In myths across the globe, there are stories of gods who left, of ancestors who fell from grace, of golden ages lost in fire and flood, and there are warnings, always warnings, not to repeat what was done. The Tower of Babel, the flood of Deucalion, the fire that consumed the world of the Hopi, the texts of the Mahabharata, which describe weapons of such terrifying power that even today they raise eyebrows among scholars. Stories too early and too precise, too consistent across cultures, too easy to dismiss. Maybe these were metaphors, but maybe they were memories. If a civilization once rose high enough to threaten its own existence, it may have left behind more than ruins. It may have left behind safeguards, gaps in the record, clues hidden only in genetic drift, warnings disguised as stories, systems designed not to preserve, but to forget. Because knowledge is power, and power misused destroys, we look for monuments, for machines. But perhaps the greatest mark of a civilization is not what it leaves behind, but what it chooses not to. What if the missing pieces are missing by design? What if the silence is protective? And what if, in our digging, we are waking something they meant us never to find? The knowledge that breaks us. Some truths illuminate, others burn. History teaches us that not all knowledge is neutral. Some ideas uplift, others unravel. Not because they are false, but because we are not ready for them. We think of knowledge as progress, as light pushing back the darkness. But even light can blind, and sometimes what lies hidden is hidden for a reason. What if the collapse of past civilizations wasn't caused by natural disaster or invasion, but by discovery? A technology that outpaced wisdom, an idea that fractured the mind, a power that could not be restrained. Every culture has its version of this myth, a sacred fire stolen from the gods, a forbidden fruit eaten in defiance, A secret name spoken aloud. A tower built too high, a line crossed. And always, the result is the same. Fall, ruin, exile, silence. These stories endure because they touch something timeless, a truth woven into the human condition, that we reach before we reflect, that we awaken forces before we understand them. In our world, we see glimpses of this today, artificial intelligence racing ahead of comprehension. Climate systems pushed to the brink, weapons that can destroy cities in a breath. We hold knowledge vast enough to reshape the earth, but not always the wisdom to wield it. Now imagine a civilization older than ours, one that rose high, far higher, and fell farther still, not because they lacked genius, but because they lacked restraint. If such a people existed, would they try to preserve their discoveries? Or would they do everything in their power to erase them? To leave behind not knowledge but warning, not monuments, but myths? What if the story of Prometheus isn't about the gift of fire, but the danger of giving it too soon? And what if we are the next in line to receive a gift we are not ready for? We assume we are discovering lost truths, but perhaps we are trespassing, unsealing doors they meant to keep closed, chasing signals they buried, decoding warnings they wrapped in parable. What if some mysteries are not puzzles to be solved, but locks? Not everything buried should be unearthed. Not every silence needs to be broken. Some knowledge is not lost, it is hidden, not to punish us, but to protect us. And the question we must ask is not just, can we find the truth, but should we? Because sometimes what ends a civilization is knowing too much, too fast. What if the story we're writing has already been told? Not exactly, not in the details, but in the rhythm, the shape, the rise, the fall, the silence that follows. We like to believe we're unprecedented, that our challenges are unique, our inventions unmatched, that no one has ever faced what we face now. But the earth is old, older than us, older than memory, and it remembers patterns, even when we do not. We look back at ruins and see mystery, but what if they are mirrors, not just echoes of the past, but reflections of our present, warnings set in stone? Maybe that's what ruins really are, messages from ourselves to ourselves, not meant to explain the past, but to help us survive the future, because all the signs are here again, the acceleration. A civilization on fast forward, technology advancing faster than comprehension, ecologies collapsing faster than we can restore them, information growing faster than wisdom. We've been here before, perhaps, not us, but someone, a species, a people, a civilization that walked a similar path, built, consumed, reached, and then vanished. We think we are safe from collapse because we are global, connected, industrial, digital. But those very systems may be what make us fragile. One failure cascades, one chain breaks, one resource runs dry and the structure buckles. The smarter we become, the more dangerous our mistakes. If we are following in ancient footsteps, retracing a path that led somewhere terrible, then the knowledge we are uncovering isn't to just history, it's prophecy, the return of buried fire. We are digging into the earth, mining deeper, drilling further, reactivating forces long dormant, seeking energy, profit, power. But what if, in that digging, we uncover more than we expected? Every year we find anomalies, artifacts where they shouldn't be, cities beneath oceans, fused glass in ancient deserts, genetic anomalies with no known lineage, tools that shouldn't exist, patterns in mythology that mirror our own development, but thousands of years too early. We dismiss them, too inconvenient, too disruptive. But they whisper the same story. You are not the first. And now, as we build AI, as we tinker with the genome, as we shift the climate without fully understanding the consequences, we may be awakening what others once silenced, not some ancient evil. But the same pattern, the same hubris, the same fatal error. What if the fall isn't a single event, but a loop? Civilizations reach a certain threshold, a point of no return. And unless something fundamentally changes in thinking, in values, in restraint, collapse is inevitable. The archaeology of denial. We imagine ourselves as archaeologists of the past, digging, decoding, discovering. But perhaps what we're really uncovering is our own denial. We know more than we admit. We've seen the patterns, the carbon in the air, the heat in the oceans, the fragility of our systems. We've read the myths. We've unearthed the evidence. We've heard the warnings, not just from the past, but from our own scientists, our own artists, our own intuition. But still, we go on, as if we are immune, as if the laws of collapse do not apply to us. It's not ignorance. It's inertia. We are trapped in a story of growth, of consumption, of more. A story that worked until it didn't, and somewhere deep down, we know. We've been told to look ahead, but maybe the answers are behind us, in ruins, in remnants, in dreams that don't belong to us, the memory in matter. Some knowledge doesn't vanish. It lingers in magnetic signatures, in isotopic layers, in genetic code, in myth. We are made of memories we do not recognize, and perhaps the Earth is too. Some speculate that certain materials, crystal structures, quantum systems, even DNA, may hold information in ways we do not yet understand. Not just records, but warnings, encoded experience. What if the next breakthrough in human understanding isn't a new discovery, but a recovered one? A language buried in our cells, a map encoded in mitochondrial lines, an instruction passed forward through millennia, waiting for us to understand it. And what if that message is simple? Do not do what we did. Do not go where we went. Do not awaken what we could not control. But would we listen, or would we dismiss it, as we have before? The final chapter isn't written. Despite everything, we are still here, still alive, still capable of changing course. Maybe that's what separates us from the ones who came before. Not intelligence, not technology, but awareness. We know we're fragile. We know the stakes. We know the cost of inaction. And we also know, in our bones, in our stories, in our science, that we may not be the first to stand at this crossroads. That gives us a choice. We can follow the old path, pretend we are alone, ignore the signs, repeat the cycle, or we can break it. We can become the civilization that learns, that listens, that sees the mirror in the ruins we trod, and chooses another ending. We can still change the story. And if we do, maybe one day, far in the future, another people will find our traces, our cities, our stories, our DNA, and they will ask the same question we ask now. Who were they? What happened here? And perhaps for once, the answer will not be silence, not collapse, but continuity, a legacy, not of ruin, but of wisdom. The earth is old, older than our cities, older than our languages, older than anything we can truly grasp. Mountains rise and crumble, oceans expand and retreat, ice sheets come and go, life endures and forgets. And in that forgetting, there is loss, but also mystery. We live, each of us, in a narrow window of time, a few decades at most. And yet we look out over tens of thousands of years, trying to understand who we are and where we come from. The story we tell today is remarkable, of a species that rose from the savannas, spread across the globe, and invented art, science, and memory. But perhaps that story is incomplete. Perhaps we are not the first to build, not the first to reach, not the first to fall in love with the stars. And if that is true, if Earth has known other civilizations before us, then we are part of a cycle far greater than anything we've imagined. Not a ladder, but a spiral. Not a climb, but a rhythm. Civilizations rise, they flourish, they fall. And from the silence, something new begins. We often speak of history as a record, a list of events. But true history, deep history, is a kind of silence, a vast, unlit hallway, filled with doors we have not yet opened. Göbekli Tepe. The Indus Valley, the stories of Atlantis, the flood myths told in every corner of the world, hints, shadows, questions. Not all will lead somewhere. Some are dead ends, some are fantasies. But some may be the first cracks in a wall we have mistaken for the edge of the world. To explore these possibilities requires more than curiosity. It requires humility, the humility to say, we don't know everything, the humility to question our assumptions, the humility to imagine that we are not alone, not in the cosmos, perhaps, but in the corridors of deep time. Because what we call modern may only be recent, and what we call primitive may only be unseen. We live in a moment of extraordinary power, but power without perspective is dangerous, and perspective only comes when we step back, beyond our cities, beyond our machines, beyond even our written history, and ask the deeper question, what kind of ancestors do we want to be? If there was a civilization before us, the people who dreamed, who built, who were lost, then their final legacy is this: a warning, a hope, and a story not yet finished. Because in the end, the question is not whether there was a civilization before ours. The question is, will there be one after, and what will they find of us? Pause, a slow fade to black, then silence. Not empty, just waiting. Beneath our feet lie forgotten worlds, not just dust and stone, but memory, cities lost to jungle, coastlines swallowed by rising seas, structures erased not by failure, but by time's quiet erosion. We look at the ruins and call them primitive. We see scattered stones and imagine they never dreamed as we do. But what if they did? What if the myths are not fantasies, but memories, distorted by time, softened by story? Atlantis, the great flood. Sky gods, lost islands, golden ages. We dismiss them, because to believe them would mean admitting we are not the beginning, and perhaps not the pinnacle. Time does not move in a straight line. It loops, it folds, it forgets, and every so often it remembers. A memory carved into stone, unearthed long after its language is gone. A temple aligned to forgotten stars. A myth repeated in a dozen cultures that never met. We live in a clearing between two unknowns, what came before and what comes next. We imagine ourselves advanced, but advancement is not immunity. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, and the earth moves on. If others came before us, we are not standing at the top. We are standing in a cycle, not a ladder, but a spiral, a rhythm we have not yet learned to hear. So the question is not, are we alone in the cosmos, but are we alone in time? What might we find if we dared to look deeper, beneath the oceans, beneath the deserts, beneath our own assumptions? We may find nothing, or we may find fragments, clues that rewrite everything. And if we do, will we believe them, or will we bury them again, because they don't fit the story we like to tell ourselves? We often think of history as progress, a march forward from ignorance to enlightenment. But real history is not so clean. It is jagged, interrupted, often lost, written in ash as much as ink. Every empire believed it would last forever, until it didn't. Every people thought they were the end point, until they were forgotten. We are not immune. We are not special, but we are here. And that still means something. So the question is not just, what will we become? The question is, what will we leave behind? Will we leave behind ruins, or meaning, debris, or direction? Will the next two rise from the ashes, human or not, find only warnings in our wreckage? Or will they find wisdom in how we chose to live and how we chose to end? We measure greatness by what we build, skyscrapers, satellites, servers, but perhaps we should measure it by what we protect, by what we choose to understand instead of control, by how we treat the planet that made us, by how deeply we listen to the earth, to each other, and to the long echo of time. This moment is ours, not forever, but enough enough to choose differently, enough to plant seeds, not just in soil, but in thought, in story, in memory, in kindness, enough to become ancestors worth remembering. What if legacy isn't power? What if legacy is restraint? What if the true test of a civilization isn't how far it can reach, but how gently it can hold what it already has? We are not the first. We will not be the last. But we are now, and now is powerful. Now is the hinge between what was and what will be. If we are wise, we won't just ask what we can build, but what we can carry forward. Not just technology, but values. Not just monuments, but meaning. Because in the silence of deep time, everything man-made crumbles. But intention lingers, choices echo. And maybe, just maybe, that echo becomes a beacon, a light in someone else's dark, a voice in someone else's beginning. We don't need to know how the story started. We may never know. But we are writing this chapter, and what we write matters. The earth is patient. It does not hurry. It does not forget. It has seen fire and ice, war and wonder. It has held secrets older than our languages. It has buried civilizations and waited for the next, waited for us. So, what do we leave behind? When the satellites fall, when the lights go out, when the maps fade and our names are no longer spoken, what trace of us will remain? What legacy will endure? A warning, a hope, a quiet invitation to begin again, wiser, kinder, and listening, because the future is watching and the earth remembers. Not everything, just enough to whisper again, and maybe this time someone will listen.